You're listening to Beyond Bizarre True Crime, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Zodiac Speaking, Scene of the Crime, and 3 Men and a Mystery. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
Welcome to this episode of Beyond Bizarre True Crime. I'm your host for this episode. My name is Justin. I have a few different podcasts that I host, the main two being Mysterious Circumstances and the Sweetiana Project. I'll tell you a little bit about those after this episode, but for now, we're going to be talking about the death of Patsy Wright. This case is one of those classic whodunit mysteries, so we're going to have a lot of suspects to talk about, so you're going to have to pay attention to this one. Patsy grew up in Park Cities, Texas. She was one of 2 children. She had a sister named Sally. Her parents were Tom and Virginia Bolton. Virginia was a housewife, and Tom was a successful oil man with a passion for Texas history. In the early 60s, he took a trip to London to see Madame Tussauds' famous wax museum, and that's how he decided to start a wax museum. Now, Patsy attended Hillcrest High School and ended up joining the family business in 1973 in the Public Relations Department. Patsy's father died in 1976, so her and her sister Sally wanted to take over the company. There was a really bad inheritance battle between the sisters and their stepmother. Sally and Patsy ended up winning that, and they became controlling owners of the Wax Museum. They did a good job of running it, but some friends say that there was an undercurrent of feelings not common, between sisters really. And that all kind of stems from Sally was really jealous about Patsy's good looks, and she was very appealing to men. Sally always felt that Patsy had allowed men to use her. And Patsy was always super impatient with the fact that Sally would never stand up for herself. Just like any siblings, they had a couple differences, but for the most part they got along really well. Now on October 23rd, 1987, at 3 a.m. in Arlington, Texas, Patsy Wright, aged 43 at the time, called her sister Sally Horning and told her that she couldn't breathe. Her brother-in-law Steve is the one who answered the phone, and Patsy had originally asked for Sally. Sally said that she overheard Patsy's voice say, "I've taken some NyQuil and something's really, really wrong." Well, Patsy ended up having a very violent reaction to this, and all of a sudden she stopped talking and dropped the phone. Sally called the police department, but because she didn't know the address of Patsy's rental house, the police dispatcher couldn't send an ambulance. So Steve and Sally jumped in their car, and they went the few miles to Patsy's house on Holm Oak Street. The front door was locked, and Sally did not have a key. She later remembered Patsy telling her that the spare keys she kept over the double oven had disappeared. So Steve crawled into the bedroom window, because Patsy had left this window cracked open, and he goes to the front door and lets Sally in. They tried to wake Patsy up, but she was unresponsive. They both noticed that Patsy's burglar alarm had not been set. She had put one in, after someone had broken several windows in her house. They also noticed that nothing was missing, despite the fact that Patsy had paintings and some other valuables in the house. So Sally calls 911 and Steve starts performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on Patsy. During that mouth-to-mouth, a large amount of green fluid came out of her mouth, according to Steve. The paramedics had arrived a few minutes later and took Patsy to the hospital. Now, on the way to the hospital, the paramedics later told Sally that there was nothing more that they could do for Patsy, and they declared her dead. At the time, her family and the police did not suspect foul play. Since she had mentioned taking some cold medicine in her phone call, the investigators took the bottle for possible analysis. Then, 8 days later after her memorial service, an autopsy was performed. Blood samples were fed into a $100,000 machine called a gas chromatographic mass spectrometer, and then those samples were compared to the chemical fingerprints of more than 4,000 compounds. After about 20 minutes, the computer read out a big spike, and then the computer spit out one word, and it said strychnine. The test revealed that there was strychnine in Patsy's bloodstream. Now, strychnine poisoning has some pretty horrible side effects. It's extremely brutal, but it's also very rare. Now, after these results came back from the autopsy, investigators had that medicine tested. Large amounts of strychnine were also found in the medicine. The FBI ruled out product tampering, so it was assumed that either Patsy committed suicide or someone close to her had placed this poison in her medicine. So the investigators started looking a little deeper. Patsy seemed like she had everything to live for. She was very close to her 2 children, along with her sister Sally. The 2 sisters, like I had mentioned, had co-owned 2 wax museums worth over $6 million. Also, Patsy had recently bought 3 prized quarter horses that she was planning on training. So after unusual deaths, most counties require the medical examiner to complete a physical autopsy of the victim. In Tarrant County, the medical examiner had consulting psychologist Dr. Joanne Houts perform a psychological autopsy of Patsy Wright. The psychologist interviewed friends and family to basically get to the bottom of Patsy's state of mind at the time of her death. Dr. Houts' findings revealed a very strong, independent woman who often avoided confrontation in public, but firmly spoke her mind in private. In Houts' professional opinion, Patsy was a low psychological risk for suicide. She fit none of the criteria. She was under no financial strain, her health was excellent, she was planning for the future, and the day she died, her alarm clock went off, which indicated she intended to wake up that morning. So based on the evidence, the investigators felt suicide was highly unlikely. So the case was then investigated as a homicide. So the authorities now had to go through the last days of Patsy's life to determine who would have poisoned her. It was believed that her murderer was someone that she had known very well. She had not set the burglar alarm the night that she died, and Stephen, her brother-in-law, later said he remembered he had moved her dinner tray with 2 dinner plates on it away from her bed so he could perform CPR on her. Now, because of the 2 dinner plates on this dinner tray, there's a theory that she had a man over that night. Now, she was seeing someone at the time of her death, a guy named Larry Todd, but he lived 3 hours away and had an alibi for that night. Todd, at the time, worked for a state agency. He said that he had talked to her on the phone from his home in Austin the night she died. Patsy's daughter also said that when she passed away, he was pretty devastated. So he was quickly ruled out as a suspect. Now, there's only a few people who were close enough to her to know that when she had trouble sleeping, she would take nighttime cold medicine. Now, the main cop on the case, a guy named Gustafson, he said, everyone I talked to said they knew she took it. So to him, that meant that the killer had to be someone who Patsy knew intimately and targeted her specifically. It also meant the killer could bide his time because they didn't necessarily have to poison her that night. They could have slipped that in 2 weeks beforehand because they knew that eventually she would have trouble sleeping and go to take that to help her sleep. The strychnine that killed Patsy was in a pure powder form. This is the most concentrated type of strychnine available. Within 15 minutes of ingestion, victims experience muscular twitching, followed by a sensation of suffocation and a sudden onset of massive convulsions. The head and feet are bent backwards in tetanic spasms. The face turns blue, and the mouth contracts into a fixed grin. Now, each convulsion is followed by a period of relaxation, and at this time, whoever's poisoned by this is just awaiting the next symptom or the next contraction or the next convulsion. The death is ultimately caused by paralysis of the respiratory muscles. It's a pretty brutal and horrific death, to be honest with you. Now, with that being said, the bottle of NyQuil that they had taken and tested contained enough strychnine to kill 8 or 9 people. Now, there are fewer than 600 outlets nationwide that deal with this type of poison, and all sales are regulated by the federal government. So it's not exactly an easy thing to get under the radar. Now, on the day of Patsy's death, her daughter Leslie also received a strange phone call. The caller insisted that she had to speak with Patsy, and Leslie told her that her mother had passed away. The caller then said, "Good, I wanted her dead." Now, Leslie believes that either the call was a hoax or the caller wanted to ensure that Patsy had in fact died. So when this dude Gustafson starts investigating and asking questions of friends and family, this is when the finger pointing started. Someone would tell Gustafson that he ought to look at so-and-so, and then when he would go and question that person would turn around and point the finger at the previous person and say, you know what, you should really look at them though. So they really had a confusing investigation because they had all these family members and all these people pointing the fingers at each other as somebody who could be responsible, because the one thing that we know is that whoever did this was very familiar with Patsy, knew her routine, knew her very, very well. Now, let's get into some suspects and some theories. There are several possible suspects in Patsy's murder, and like I had previously mentioned, based on the evidence, investigators believe that Patsy was killed by someone that was close to her. The very first 2 people considered were Sally and Steve Horning, Patsy's sister and brother-in-law. A possible motive for wanting Patsy dead involved the wax museums. When Patsy died, the museums were inherited by the Hornings. But investigators did not believe that Steve would have given Patsy mouth-to-mouth resuscitation if he had poisoned her, since that would potentially put him at risk for getting dangerous poison in his mouth as well. But my big question on this is, who witnessed him giving the mouth-to-mouth? Is this just something that he said he did? Or did Sally actually witness this as well? They could have just said that. We also have to take into consideration, we don't exactly know that he had the knowledge of her being poisoned at the time of CPR. He could have just thought something was wrong, she was sick, she might have drinking too much, something like that. He did not have the knowledge that she was actually poisoned at the time of CPR. So Steve and Sally, along with other family members, voluntarily took polygraphs. They all passed. Now, I will say this, as we know, polygraphs are inadmissible in court because of their unreliability. I personally don't care if they passed because I look at polygraphs as like a basic stress test. And like I said, they are inadmissible in court because of the unreliability of them. Now, Steve says that he and Patsy had a good but distant relationship. But when that description of their relationship was told to Patsy's friends and family, they did not agree. Patsy and her brother-in-law Steven did not actually get along very well, and Patsy went to significant lengths to see that he would never have access to any of her money if anything happened to her or her sister. She considered him a fake and plastic guy, and also recognized the fact that he had mismanaged money. She even told friends and family that. They also say that it made Patsy really mad that in just a few years of Steve and Sally being married, he had spent Sally's inheritance and had gone into debt for that much more, playing the commodities market and basically going big game hunting all the time. Now, in June of 1987, Patsy had discussed making a major change in a buy-sell agreement she had with Sally. She never wanted Steve owning any percentage of her assets. And how this worked out was each sister had a $500,000 life insurance policy on the other sister. If one of them died, the survivor had to use the money to buy out the other's share of stock, leaving one sister as the sole owner. The other sister's heirs would split the $500,000. It really seemed like a good plan when they signed it in June of 1985, just a couple of years before this happened, but several things had happened since that time that made Patsy really uneasy about the whole situation. One of which was the museum stock had escalated in value. Another thing is that Sally was diagnosed as having cancer in the fall of 1985. Sally and Steve had been having marital problems prior to the diagnosis, but even Patsy admitted to friends that Steve had been extremely supportive of Sally during that difficult time period. So, if she died with the buy-sell agreement in place, Steve would receive $500,000. But Sally went through chemotherapy and her cancer was declared in remission that summer. Both sisters agreed that the buy-sell agreement needed to be changed. They actually scheduled a board meeting for early November to discuss the changes, but Patsy died 2 weeks before that meeting. So, because they never changed it, when Patsy died, the buy-sell agreement went into effect. Now, despite Patsy's kids pleading that Sally give them their mom's stock instead of money, Sally refused. She told them that they were too young and the stock was worth more than it had been when the agreement was signed. Now, while this is going on, Steve, who was under community property laws, had claimed to 25% of the stock. But if Sally dies before Steve, he will own a controlling share of the stock in the museum, and this is exactly what Patsy was trying to prevent. Now, it came down to even on the afternoon before her death, Patsy was talking to a friend and she went into this huge rant about Steve. And she said, "I don't want Steve Horning anywhere around me." So, it brings up the question, did Steve, Patsy's brother-in-law, with or without his wife's knowledge, poison Patsy? Like I said, Steve took 2 polygraphs. The first was inconclusive, but he passed the second. He had cooperated with police and the Unsolved Mysteries crew, which is where I found this case at, an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I will state all my sources at the end, but that's where I initially found this. And Steve also endorsed his wife's idea of hiring a private investigator. He was all for it. So he's totally cooperative here. Now, there are still some weird discrepancies though. Steve says that he gave Patsy mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, at which time he took a green liquid into his mouth and then he spit it out. Now, would he have done that if he knew that she had been poisoned? And if he actually did do it, why didn't he just dump out the bottle of medicine or just hide it or take it? Now, in the actual tape of the emergency phone call, Sally, who was talking to the dispatcher, can be heard telling Stephen, "You have to blow into her mouth," because she was pretty much instructing Steve on how to do the CPR. Now, the paramedics told Gustafson, the main detective on this case from the beginning, that Patsy had regurgitated large amounts of clear liquid the instant they began CPR. And they also told Gustafson that nobody successfully performed CPR on this woman. So, did Steve actually pretend to perform CPR? Or did he just not know what he was doing? And then we have to take into the consideration of the plates. Like I had said, Steve insisted that he had moved a table with 2 plates away from Patsy's bed, as if Patsy had a guest over that night in the bedroom and they were eating some food. But neither the firemen nor the paramedics remembered the tables or plates being in the room. So was Steve setting up the idea that the murderer had been in Patsy's room that night? Because, he could sit there and prove that he was at home with his wife, or was his memory just shoddy? It's hard telling. Another person that investigators looked into was a guy named Leo Fikes. He was considered a suspect because he was very close to her and knew that she took cold medicine before bed. Fikes says that they saw each other a few times during the summer of 1987, but that things between them were tense. And Patsy pretty much gave him no hope for their relationship. And he claims, like I said, that they weren't close anymore at the time of her death, and he had rarely seen her in the months prior to that. Now, Fikes also admits that he was pretty torn up by her rejection, but he insisted that he did not kill her. Investigators discovered that Fikes had made a purchase in the summer of 1987 at the only outlet in Dallas that sells strychnine. Now, when they got his receipt, strychnine was not one of the things on it. Now, he also took a polygraph and passed as well. Now, several months after beginning the investigation, Gustafson got an anonymous phone call, and all the person said was, "Did you know that Leo Fikes dated Linda Donahue?" And that was it. Linda Donahue was a woman from Arlington who was found by her sister in her bedroom, murdered. Her nude body had been stabbed through the neck, and she was smeared with blood. Now, Gustafson knew that Patsy had dated and dumped Leo Fikes. So it brings up the question, could he have access to that strychnine? Obviously he could. But he's also searching through Donahue's personal effects, and the detectives found Leo Fikes' business card. When Gustafson called Leo Fikes in for questioning, the first thing Leo said was, "I was wondering when you were going to get to me." Kind of shady, right? But as for Patsy's murder, Fikes passed a polygraph test and voluntarily took part in the filming of the Unsolved Mysteries episode. Gustafson said he had not ruled out anybody in this investigation. That would include Leo Fikes. Now, Fikes was also not under investigation for the death of Linda Donahue. Detectives were satisfied that he dated her only a few times. He was eventually ruled out as a suspect in Patsy's death and passed away in 2014. Now, like I said, we have more than one suspect that we have to think about, and the main one is probably her ex-husband, Bob Cox. He was considered a suspect after police learned that she had gotten a restraining order against him because he was harassing her. Multiple people gave statements to police indicating that Patsy was fearful of Bob. He had driven by or parked close to her home numerous times after they divorced. She told family members that he had been watching her in the days before her death. She was also afraid to testify against him in an arson trial that was to take place around the time of her murder. He had called her on several occasions telling her that she should change her story, but she told him that she was going to tell the truth. The stalking that this guy did was crazy. He would wear disguises when he would park outside her house and stuff. It was crazy, right? So a few months before Bob and Patsy got married, on February 1st, 1983, shortly after midnight, there were some fires set in the wax museum that Bob owned with his ex-wife, Emily Cox, who went by the nickname Kitty. So after Bob and Patsy married, he sued his insurance company for refusing to pay out for the damage. The insurance company claimed that Bob had started the fires for the insurance money because he was in crazy-ass debt. Bob Cox later claimed that it was some homeless people who were looking for a place to stay that actually set the fires. The attorneys would allege that Cox caused the fires to be set, bringing out in the trial that he and a lot of his companies were in dire financial straits. Money is always a huge motive in murder, as we all know. So Patsy owned her wax museum, and it was extremely successful. She was also unaware of Bob's finances at the time that they got married. Now, the insurance company would imply that Bob married Patsy for financial reasons, and this is why he became extremely abusive immediately after they got married. She actually said almost instantly she would tell friends that it began on her wedding day, that Bob Cox changed. He was no longer charming. He really wasn't that nice. He became verbally abusive to her and her family. And then Patsy caught on to Bob's financial situation. Patsy got really mad at Bob because he was living off of her earnings, and she was pretty much paying all the bills and also paying for his gambling addiction. And one of the headers for them getting a divorce was when the IRS tried to attach her earnings to pay for Bob Cox's tax debts of about $300,000. Bob met the tax agent at the door, and he was wearing like real shitty clothes, looking like he was, didn't have any money, right? Just playing the role. So Patsy, she ended up getting a hold of Bob Cox's ex-wife, Kitty, and she gave Patsy the name of a marriage counselor she had seen with Bob before their divorce. The counselor told Patsy that Bob was a sociopath and advised her to get out of the marriage immediately. So they separated. After that, Bob began following Patsy around, parking outside of her house. And like I said, this dude was wearing disguises and shit, just seeing what she is doing. At one point in time, one of Bob Cox's employees called Patsy and told her that Bob had borrowed her car in order to follow Patsy around. And Patsy also told friends that Bob Cox had often threatened to ruin her. Now, naturally, because of the stalking, Patsy was pretty fucking scared, as any of us would be. Now, like I had mentioned, Bob had offhand mentioned a lot of things at the beginning of their marriage, one of which being he knew people who could get anything done, including having someone snuffed out. So she decided to listen to the advice of her family, and she installed a security system and got a restraining order against him after they had separated. Now, at some point in 1986, he stopped stalking her. In September of that year, Bob Cox's attorney called up Patsy for the upcoming civil trial on the fires at Bob's wax museum. The attorney met with Patsy multiple times to discuss a lot of the information that she had about Bob. And a lot of this was because Patsy was in the wax museum business herself. As wild as it sounds, she was uniquely qualified to speak on some of the things that she saw there, and she actually knew their worth. So this attorney met with her 8 to 10 times in 1986 and 1987 to discuss all the values of the property. Now, it should also be known that Patsy was murdered 10 days before the start of the trial date that was set for November of 1987. Bob Cox ended up winning the arson trial, and the jury awarded him $1.3 million because the insurance company was unable to establish that he had set the fire. Ironically enough, these fires did not stop there. 11 months after Patsy died, Patsy's wax museum burned to the ground. Arson investigators ruled that the fire had started at an electrical box. The insurance paid $4 million. It wasn't enough to replace the museum, which would have cost about $5.5 million to rebuild. With all that being said, Bob Cox was always considered a suspect in her murder, but there have never been any charges made in her death. And it should also be known that he was the only one to refuse a polygraph test. Now, investigators did find some evidence that may have pointed to another unknown individual being responsible for the murder. Because if what Steve Horning said was true about the dinner plates on the tray next to her bed and her having a guest that night, it would seem really, really unlikely that Leo or Robert would have been over there eating with her, so they would have not been in the house and been able to get to her NyQuil. Like I said, there were keys missing from above her stove as well, so this could suggest that she had someone over that night that ended up poisoning her. It could not mean that. We don't know. It was discovered, though, that days after Patsy's death, a husband and wife named Bill and Bonnie Alexander, they were a couple from Hyco, Texas. They boarded Patsy's horses. They cashed a check that she had given them. She had written in the date, which was the day before her death, and signed her name next to a notation that read Saddle. The Alexanders had added the word fees and filled in the amount for $4,000. The day that Patsy died, she had decided to liquidate some of her assets in order to make $125,000 available. Now, when one of Patsy's associates asked if there were any outstanding checks she would need to cover, Patsy never mentioned the $4,000 check to the Alexanders. Now, the family grew really suspicious when they learned that Patsy's expensive horses were in the Alexanders' names. The Alexanders had become a major part of Patsy's life in that previous year before her death, and Patsy had told several friends that if she could find a man like Bill Alexander, she'd marry him. And this was a huge deal, because after her first marriage and a failed second relationship, she had also told people that she would never ever get married again. So that statement was a huge deal to family and friends. Patsy had also bought several horses through the Alexanders and was paying them for board and training. She had also spent the month of June living with them, and she was basically there working on her writing skills. So Bonnie Alexander says that Patsy gave them the check and simply told them to add up what she owed for several months' board and contest entry fees. Now, these horses were in the Alexanders' names for another good reason. Patsy didn't want her brother-in-law, Steve Horning, to get his hands on them in case something happened to her. This is coming from Bonnie, that's what she said. But family members also wonder about the Alexanders and some of their motives. Now, even though there really isn't any evidence to support a theory of them doing anything to Patsy, they suggest that Bill might have been in love with Patsy and been rebuffed because Patsy didn't want to hurt Bonnie. and realizing that he was about to lose the horses and a large portion of income when she moved to Aledo, was Bill one of the guys that was going to poison her? It's hard saying. It's not a huge suspect or thing on my list, but it does have to be noted. Maybe it was Bonnie who was jealous of Patsy. Obviously, Bill was intrigued by her. Patsy also was known to say that if she could find a man like Bill, she would definitely marry him. And we also have to remember that the person who called Patsy's daughter after she had died and said, "Good, I wanted her dead," that person was a female. So we also have to remember that. Now, Gustafson, when he was researching all the stuff with strychnine, he had discovered that in the past, the poison was sometimes used by horse breeders to treat their animals. So he asked them to both take a polygraph. Both of them passed. And that's pretty much when everything stopped. We still don't know what exactly happened. Here are some extra notes that we do have to mention. I had mentioned that Patsy's Wax Museum went down in an arson fire in 1988. A man named Stanley Pointer was later caught trying to steal a ledger from the museum's ashes after it had burned down. He also had a previous arrest for arson, and because of this, he was investigated in this arson case along with Patsy's death. He was never charged though. He ended up dying in a police-involved incident in 1991. Patsy was also married a first time to a guy named Bill Wright. That's how she got her last name, obviously. It should be known, though, that the divorce was very amicable, and they had gotten along so well that she had even designated him the executor of her estate in her will. So that brings up the facts. Somebody knew that Patsy Wright would take a little nips of NyQuil to help her sleep every now and then. One night, that somebody slipped strychnine in it. That somebody still has not been caught. Gustafson said, "When someone can go to the extent of putting a scheme together like this, there's no sense of urgency. This isn't rage. This isn't a domestic fracas. This one is just put the stuff in and just walk away." They knew that sooner or later she would drink it. And that's pretty much where we are on this case. Like I said, lots of suspects, lots of details, lots of stuff to think about. A couple good suspects, I think, that are better than some other ones, but there you have it. With that episode behind us, I got some sources for you. We got unsolvedmysteries.fandom.com, wiki, Patsy Wright. We got the Unsolved Mysteries episode, which aired April 26th, 1989. We also have ashleykwrights.medium.com, which is a great article, along with dmagazine.com, which also had a phenomenal article on it. So, with that being said, huge thank you to Morph for inviting me on to cover a topic. I get into the true crime stuff, obviously, or I wouldn't be here. A little bit about my podcast before we sign off. I am the host of Mysterious Circumstances. I've been doing that podcast since 2016. I cover quite a bit of everything on there, really. Lots of unsolved weird crimes, conspiracies, debunking paranormal events, historical criminals. It's kind of a melting pot of all kinds of different stuff because I have a lot of different interests and things that I'm curious about. So also conduct like a lot of interviews on there with certain people and authors and stuff like that. So it's kind of nice. I can switch it up and do pretty much whatever I want on there. If that's, might be your thing, go check it out. My other podcast is a seasonal podcast. It's strictly true crime. Season 1 of the Sweetiana Project was the Jennings 8 case out of Louisiana. Season 2 is what's currently going on right now, and we are covering the deaths out of Lawton, Oklahoma from 1999 to 2004. If you get into that kind of stuff, you can go check them out. If not, that's totally cool too. Again, Morph, thank you for having me on the podcast. I hope all of you listeners enjoyed it. And don't forget to tune in for the next episode of Beyond Bizarre True Crime, which will be hosted by Cambo from True Crime Island. And until next time, I'll see you folks on the flip side.
Beyond Bizarre True Crime is produced by Mike Morford and Jess Betancourt for AbJack Entertainment, with music by Connor Betancourt. If you enjoy this podcast, make sure to subscribe wherever you are listening now, and please take a moment to rate and review the show. You can find Beyond Bizarre True Crime on social media. We're on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @BeyondBizarreTC. You can also find us on Facebook by searching for Beyond Bizarre True Crime Podcast. The views and opinions of the hosts and guests on Beyond Bizarre True Crime do not necessarily represent those of the show's creators, producers, or sponsors. Be sure to tune in on Saturdays for all new episodes of Beyond Bizarre True Crime.